In this lecture, we are going to be exploring Chapter 16, The Ancient World. Now, a couple things to note as we get started. This chapter, it's the first of the history chapters, and what he is doing is he's trying to give you an idea of the different developing civilizations within the world. Don't get overwhelmed with this. Remember, like I said, we're going to focus on specific artistic styles. And I don't want you to approach this as a history class where you're trying to remember important names and dates, but I want you to focus on the different artistic styles that we're going to see. And he starts with the very beginning. We have the artwork that you see here, which is from about 30,000 BCE, which is before the current era. And this is the wall paintings in the Chauvet Cave, they were discovered in the 1990s in France. And here we can see, as long ago as over 32,000 years ago, humans were creating art. For this lecture, there are 5 main types of artistic styles I want you to pay attention to. The first we're just going to term as prehistoric, then Egyptian, and then the Aegean and early Greek, and then Greek Classicalism and Roman Classicalism. I will be touching briefly on some of the other styles, but these are the 5 I really want you to be able to describe and talk about from this lecture. Now, what we have when we have artistic styles is usually we're looking at different civilizations. We're going to see when we have the prehistoric, it's called prehistoric because this is before the time of written language. Once civilizations start to develop, and a civilization is groups of people who share social, economic, and political entities. And they have the ability to express themselves through images and eventually through the written language. So when we begin with the prehistoric groups, we are usually looking at more nomadic groups. And what a nomadic group is these were people who didn't stay in one area, but tended to travel around. You would travel where the food was, where the better weather was, and where you could survive. Yet these groups did still create artworks. We already saw the cave painting. And then we would have works such as this one. This is the Venus of Willendorf. Don't let the name fool you. The name was given to it by the people who discovered it. Those who had it would not have termed it Venus, as we know from Greek and Roman mythology. And this was found near Willendorf, Austria. That's how it gets its name. However, it dates back to 25,000 BCE. Now, this is a small limestone statuette. And the reason why it was so small is, remember, these were nomadic people, so they carried what they owned with them. You would not have a large sculpture and be able to carry it around. Many scholars believe this is to represent a fertility god because it is a woman. And from her figure and size, they think this is going to show healthfulness and ampleness, and from that they get this idea that it was based off of fertility. Well, what ends up happening? We have the Ice Age, ends about 8,000 BCE, and humans at this point, they start to begin to domesticate animals, and they start to try to grow their own food. So we're going to start seeing transitioning from the nomadic tribes to more developed civilizations. And we're going to see that in the Neolithic Age, or the New Stone Age. And this develops about 5,000 BCE. And what we're going to hear is we're going to see permanent structures that are being created. We're going to see more advancements in agriculture. We're going to have pottery that's being made, but we're also going to see pottery with decoration added to it. Megaliths became important at this time. A megalith just means big stones. Probably the most famous is the one you see here, and this is Stonehenge. And it was created around 2000 BCE in Wiltshire, England. And what this is this is a cromlech, and it goes from the Gaelic. So crom stands for circle, and lech equals place. And henge is a circle surrounded by a ditch with built-up embankments. Now, we're not 100% sure what this was used for, but many scholars believe that it did have religious connections within it. What is interesting, though, is this is completely made out of found materials. So it's not created from mortar that was put together. What happens is this shows us that the people of this time were organized and had enough technology to bring these large stones there and then also be able to set the large stones on top. All right, well, as we continue on, we are going to see many cultures develop in Mesopotamia. Many of you have probably heard of the term the Fertile Crescent. This is that area. And what it is, it's the areas between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Because of the constant flooding, this area was very fertile, and it became a place that humans would settle down because they knew they could continually grow food in this area. And we're going to see these cultures develop between 4000 and 3000 BCE. One of these cultures were the Sumerians. They actually developed writing, schools, libraries, and had a written set of laws. They also had formal religion and communication with gods in temple-like area things that they called the ziggurats. Babylon is another Mesopotamian culture, and it probably is the most influential of the Mesopotamian cultures. One of the main things we take from Babylon was from the leader Hammurabi, and in the 18th century BCE, he was known because he actually had a written code of laws, and this is one of the oldest written code of laws that we have found within existence. Babylon did, however, fall in 1595 BCE. Next, we're going to turn our attention to the Egyptian culture. The Egyptian culture developed around the same time as the Sumerian culture, but obviously the difference is the geography. Egyptian culture flourished along the Nile River. Again, the Nile River had very dependable flooding, and that made the land very fertile. So again, it was a great place to settle because you were constantly able to grow the food you needed. And the Egyptian culture was a stable and productive culture for over 3,000 years, from about 3100 BCE to 30 BCE. And much of Egyptian culture focused around what's called the Ka, K-A. And what the Ka is it's part of the human being that defines the personality, and it survives after death. That's why we're going to see these great tombs, such as the pyramids that are built, and they were highly decorated and had objects placed in them. And this was so that spirit could enjoy these after death. And this, what you're looking at, is an example of one of these things that were created and placed in these tombs. This is the palette of King Namar from Upper Egypt. It's circa about 3000 BCE. It's made of slate, and it's 25 inches. And what this is, it's a palette, and a palette was actually a tool that was used for grinding pigment and making body or eye paint. However, this one was not. This one is merely decorative, and it was probably used as a gift to some deity. And what is depicted on this, you see the front and the back of it, and it actually shows the victory of King Narmer over the Lower Egypt. Remember, he ruled Upper Egypt, and so they were able to defeat Lower Egypt. Egyptian art usually had a very rigorous geometry to it. It was very stiff and rigid, and we're going to see a lot of figures with these hard angles. However, that began to change in about the 14th century, and that is with King Akhetaten. And what happens with this is he actually called for a more relaxed standard in the artwork. And we're going to see more focus becomes on creating these realistic figures with realistic details. And we see this very clearly in the image here. This is the bust of Queen Nefertiti, his wife. And this is circa about 1365 BCE. And it's painted limestone. But here we can see in this, compared to the previous works that are very stiff and rigid, here it looks much more lifelike. She's got a graceful curved neck. Her face seems very relaxed and very natural. Now, we don't know if this is a true likeness of what Nefertiti looked like or if it's an idealized portrait, but regardless, we know it is much more realistic than the previous works. All right, the textbook then talks about the river valley societies in India and China. I'm just going to give you a quick little overview of these, but what I want you to pay attention to again is these are the beginnings of the civilizations. So Indian civilization developed around 2700 BCE along the Indus River. This civilization actually developed very large cities that would hold between 20,000 to 5,000 50,000 people. These cities would have streets, and they actually developed a covered drainage system, so waste and water were removed from the cities. And we also see lots of works of art. Works of art tend to develop more when we have successful, thriving cities. The Indus Valley, though, began to collapse about 1800 BCE, and many scholars believe because there was a great drought at the time, and so basically it just could not hold it was not inhabitable. In North China Plain, we're going to see the develop of civilization around 7000 BCE, and this is along the Yellow River. This was ruled mostly by the Shang dynasty throughout the second millennium BCE, and here we're going to see more artwork such as pottery, jades, and shells. At this time, we're also seeing complex societies in the Americas. For example, in Mesoamerica, which is the southern tip of Mexico to about Honduras or El Salvador, we see the Olmec civilization, and this is around 1500 BCE. The Olmec civilization had large ceremonial areas in the center of the city itself, and they would create these pyramid-like mounds to celebrate, again, this religion. And then in North America, we're going to see cultures develop around the Mississippi Basin in modern-day North America, and again, we're going to see these great mounds that are being built. But the next civilization I want you to pay attention to is the Aegean and the Greek civilization. This is the precursor for what we call Greek classicalism. When we think of Greece and the Parthenon, this civilization comes first. This would have been around the Bronze Age. And here we have the Minoan people. They lived on the island of Crete around 6000 BCE. However, the culture reached its peak between 1600 and 1450 BCE. In Minoan society, the bull was a sacred animal, and the legend of the Minotaur actually comes from the society. The story behind the Minotaur was the wife of King Minos, who the society is named after. The story is that she actually gave birth to a creature that was half human, half bull. Well, Minos created this giant labyrinth where at the center the Minotaur lived. And each year, youths and maidens from the island were actually sacrificed to the Minotaur until he was finally slain. Interesting enough, in these societies, it's also believed that they worshipped female deities, and that's what you see here. This is the snake goddess. However, you can read in your textbook, we're not quite sure this is very accurate. There are some accusations that the man who originally found it, it was damaged when it was founded, and that he and his workers added details to it. But however, we are pretty sure that they did worship female deities. And then Minoan culture, strangely enough, ended very abruptly around 1450 BCE, and it's really not clear why. Some scholars have claimed maybe the Mycenaeans, which were a warlike people from the mainland, they thought maybe they came in, sacked Crete, but we're really not sure. But that transitions us to the Mycenaean culture. Again, they were a warlike people, they were from the mainland, and this civilization flourished between 1400 and 1200 BCE. This culture was highly dominated by military values. They would build large stone fortresses, and we get a lot of information from them. Probably the most famous of the Mycenaeans we know from the Greek writer Homer, his text, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And here we know the king of the Mycenaeans, who is Agamemnon, who we are looking at his death mask here. What happens is the Mycenaeans were part of the Trojan War. They were part of the Greeks who went over. In fact, Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus, his wife was Helen of Sparta, otherwise known as Helen of Troy, who was taken by the Trojan Paris, which led to the beginning of the Trojan War. But what we have here is when leaders would die, we would have these great ceremonial tombs filled with gold and silver, and they would usually create a death mask. And this is believed to be the death mask of Agamemnon, who was a king of Mycenae. Mycenae, though, did fall in 1200 BCE to Dorian invaders. However, that's going to then lead us to Greek civilization, or what we're going to term as Greek classicalism. What happens in Greek civilization is that we're going to see the rise of the city-state, or the polis. Here also there's an important shift. Instead of cultures being afraid of the gods, that these all-powerful, cruel, unknown beings, man starts to actually celebrate himself for what he can do and starts to prize his own culture and his own values and sees that his own ability to reason. And so what we're going to see at this time is that the gods actually become more human-like and less otherworldly and powerful. The Greeks wanted to portray the human form in very naturalistic details, but it was often idolized. So when we look at a sculpture, which we'll look here in a second at the scraper, we wouldn't look at it and know who it was. It wouldn't look at it and be like, oh, that's LeBron. But we would know what the character was doing, but it'd be this idealized form. And we're going to see that celebrated throughout Greece, this idea of balance, symmetry, and harmony. And we see this very clearly in the image here. This is the Parthenon, which sits atop the Acropolis in Athens. And what happens within Athens? Athens was celebrated, it's considered the birthplace of democracy, because in 500 BCE, all male citizens were actually part of the political system. Now, that's not to say everybody was. Women had no role. There were still slaves, but free male citizens could be part of the political system. And what happens, though, is that we are going to see the beginnings of philosophy. This is the time of Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And it's the beginnings of things such as organized medicine with Hippocrates and organized history under Herodotus. And so we're going to see man beginning to celebrate himself. And you see that here in the Parthenon. This is a Doric temple. Construction started in 450, or I have here 447, under the leader Pericles. And it was opened in 438 BCE. And then this obviously is a more current image of it, where it's been sacked many times. The large sculpture of Athena, who is the patron saint of Athens, not the patron saint, the patron god of Athens, was inside, and it was a large 40-foot sculpture by Phidias, and it was made of ivory and gold. And since then, looters have come in and completely taken that away. And then what we're going to see within this style, though, is it was more natural and relaxed figures. Interestingly enough, though, with the Parthenon, again, this idea of order and balance and symmetry, it's actually an optical illusion. There's really not a straight line in the Parthenon. Why? Because the Greeks understood illusion. So when you have the columns, these are Doric columns, side by side like that, from a distance, the human eye does not see them as straight. So if you actually look at the columns, they all bow out a little bit in the middle. And this is done so it appears from a distance that they are all perfectly straight and even. Also, interestingly enough, if you stood along the length, so if you look, you can see the small figure of a man, like in that upper left corner. If you stood there and somebody stood at the other end, and you're facing each other, and say I had a book in my hand and I bent down and I placed it on the ground, you would not be able to see the book, because in fact, this is also a slightly curved line. And again, it was done to help create that illusion that it appears straight. All right. Well, we're going to see Alexander the Great. Athens falls in 404 BCE in the Third Peloponnesian War, and Alexander the Great comes to power. However, he is also very supportive and celebrated of the Greek culture. So we're going to see Greek culture continue, but this is what we call Hellenism. And what happens in Hellenism is we're going to see Lysippus, who was actually the court sculptor for Alexander the Great. And he's going to change from the previous idea of the more relaxed figures. And this is where we're going to see this shifted, more idolized form. So this is what's commonly known as the scraper. And in here, we have a male athlete who is basically cleaning himself. He's scraping himself after an athletic competition. We don't know who this individual is, and in Greek society, again, that wasn't what was important. What was important was seeing this idealized form of the male body. So this isn't, again, LeBron, but this is what the idealized form is. Also, what develops, you can see from his stance. This is what's called contrapposto. And this is where we have our weight shifted. So here you can see the weight clearly rests on the left leg. And what this does, it gives an image a much more realistic form, and it puts part of the body in tension and part of the body is relaxed. We're also going to see in the later Hellenistic age, we're going to see these works become less formal and, again, more realistic and more emotional. And with emotional, we are showing this emotion through movement and the actual motion of the figures itself. So the image you see here is the Nike of Samarith. This was created about 190 BCE, and it is a large marble statue. Obviously, you can see here there's been some damage to it, but it portrays Nike, the goddess of victory, right? Nike, the shoe company, chose its name very purposefully. And what you can see here is, obviously we can't see emotion on the face because there is no face, but you can see the movement. It's almost as if she's facing into a wind, like maybe on the bow of a ship. Her wings are thrown back, and then in the draping and the folds of her clothes on her, you can see the clothing is like pressed up against her, and we can almost feel its movement. Another sculpture of the Hellenistic age that represents this is Laocoon and his sons. And this was made the 1st century CE. And it's also a marble work, and this is actually in the Vatican. You can go see it there. And here we can see movement within it, but we also see this emotion. Laocoon is the center figure, and we can see the anguish on his face. And this is based off of a myth, and this also relates to the Trojan War. What happened is the Greeks built the Trojan horse, and basically they gave it to the Trojans saying, oh, it's a peace offering, the war's over. Well, there were Greeks hidden inside the horse, and Laocoon ran down and was like, no, don't take this horse, this is a trap, right? The Greeks have been here for 10 years fighting, they're not just going to give up and go away. The god Poseidon had warned him not to warn the Trojans, but he did it anyway. And he was right. The term beware of Greeks bearing gifts, that comes from Laocoon. He said he did not trust that. He doesn't trust a Greek, even a Greek bearing a gift. And in the end, he was right. Right? Inside there were Greeks hiding. After the Trojans brought the Trojan horse within the walls of Troy, they were celebrating, and then that night, the Greeks inside snuck out of the horse, opened the gates, and Troy was then plundered, and it eventually fell. Well, what we see here is this is Poseidon punishing Laocoon, because he had told him, do not warn the Trojans. And so what we see is not only Laocoon being punished, but his sons also. And you can see they're actually being eaten by a sea serpent. Well, from Greek classicalism, we're going to shift into the Roman world. And what happens with the Roman world is they actually conquer the Greeks in about 146 BCE. But the Romans highly, highly valued Greek culture and art. So there are Greek influences all throughout the Roman world. In fact, what would happen is many of the Romans would actually bring Greek works to Rome, and then they would create copies and copies of the original works. In fact, most of the Greek works, the originals, would be lost to us, but we still have these copies that survived in the Roman world. You can look at Roman buildings, such as the Parthenon, and many of these actually adopted many Greek characteristics. So the front of the Parthenon is the post and lintel system that is in forms such as the Parthenon. The Parthenon that you just looked at. All right. The Roman world was also influenced by the Etruscans. The Etruscans were a people, we don't know a lot about them. They had a language that was very unique to them, but they were in the area of what would be present-day Florence and Rome. They also, though, were influenced by the Greek cultures, but the Etruscans were great metal workers. Interestingly enough, Romans also claim ancestry from the Trojans, the same Trojans from the Trojan War, and they claim this story is from Aeneas, who he fled Troy when it fell, and he and the other survivors from Troy. This is all the subject of Virgil's The Aeneid, and what happens with this is, and with the Aeneid, that there was a prophecy that Aeneas and them would know they were in the area where they needed to be to build their new society when they were so hungry they ate their plates. And so the Aeneid tells of their travels to different societies. But eventually what happens is they are in an area and the people give them food. And the food is actually served on this thick bread. And what the juices from the food on the bread eventually soak into the bread and it makes it soft. So once you're done eating the food on top, you then eat the bread. So they do this and then they realize, oh my gosh, we just ate our plates. We're where we need to be. And that is where modern day Rome is. And so that's one of the foundation stories. We also have the foundation story that you see in this slide. This is Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who were raised by the she-wolf. The city of Rome, again, the city itself was supposedly founded in 753 BCE by Romulus and Remus. And what happens is the she-wolf actually becomes a symbol of Rome, and it embodies the ideas of fiercely protective loyalty and the power of the motherland. As you read in this text, the actual figures of Romulus and Remus were added to this in the later Renaissance, but it still gives an idea of that celebration of the foundations. Well, beginning in the 5th century BCE, Rome starts to expand. It starts to conquer neighboring areas, and it begins to develop the empire. Art was a way. Art, again, flourished at this time because when we have successful civilizations, we have more time and effort shown to the arts. The human form was to be shown in actuality, but also very idealized. And you can see this going back to this slide in the Augustus of Prima Porta. And what this shows the Emperor Augustus. This is made about 20 BCE and it's made of marble. And what we have here is it's kind of an idealized form because we have the head of Augustus, but it's put on this idealized body very much like the Greek classical body. Augustus is dressed in the military garb, showing his role as commander-in-chief. And if you look down at the left, you see a small Cupid there. And the reason why Cupid is shown with Augustus is that Cupid is Venus's son, and it's supposed to link Augustus to Venus. So it's showing a direct connection to the gods. Also within Roman architecture, something that's very different from the Greek is we have the development of the arch. And you can see that within the triumphal arch that is shown here. This is actually the Arch of Constantine. And what happens with an arch, unlike the Greek post and lintel system that we're going to see, let me go back here, in the Parthenon, where you have columns that support a structure that lays horizontally across the top. Well, here you have to have columns all through it because the great stones don't have tensile strength, meaning they'll crush and they'll bend. Well, what happens with an arch is an arch actually pushes the force out. And so with arches, you are able to create much larger open spaced areas. And because of this development, these triumphal arches also were constructed throughout the empire. And what these triumphal arches would do is they would often celebrate great military leaders and or great victories. So this, the Arch of Constantine, was dedicated to the Emperor Constantine. Also with this Roman arch, we're going to see these larger open spaces that are developed. So and some examples of these larger open spaces are going to be like the Colosseum, which is actually made up of arcades. Arcades are a series of arches next to each other. And then also the Pantheon, not to be confused with the Parthenon, but the Pantheon is in Rome. And it was a temple to the gods, and the front of it looks a lot like the Parthenon. You're going to have the post and lintel structure with the pediment on top. However, the back of it is a large dome, and a dome is basically a series of arches put in a circular fashion. And so we are going to see that develop within the Roman classicalism. Rome also flourished with artwork, especially during the Pax Romana, which is the Peace of Rome, which was about 150 years of peace that started with Augustus in 27 BCE. However, the Roman Empire did begin to falter after around 180 CE, after the death of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And then for various reasons, the empire does finally fall. Some of these reasons were the empire just got too big. It completely surrounded the Mediterranean Sea, and there was no way for one emperor to adequately be able to control this. Different things happened where they tried to divide the empire into 4 different sections, but basically it comes down to the eastern and the western section. And what ends up happening is a series of invaders come in, and the Roman Empire does eventually fall. And that's where we're going to leave off in this chapter. There is a little bit more in the reading that's going to talk about Asian civilizations, so please do make sure you read that. But again, for our purposes, study the 5 artistic styles that I listed at the beginning and be able to talk about what clearly defines each of these styles.